Welcome to our final lecture of the week as we conclude the 1920s with a look at the election of the presidential election in 1928, the first year of the presidency of Herbert Hoover, and the dawn of the Great Depression in America, a topic we will cover in this upcoming week significantly as the week progresses. So, we will begin with the presidential election of 1928. Calvin Coolidge, the second consecutive Republican in the White House in the 1920s. Of course, we talked about Warren Harding and his victory running the final front porch campaign in 1920. Harding was elected president. Calvin Coolidge was his vice president. Harding ushered in an era of pro-business policies and basically a conservative rule that tried to strip down many of the reforms and policies that had been enacted during the progressive era in the presidencies of the presidential administrations, I should say, of Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. We talked last week about Harding's sudden death in the summer of 1923, toward the end of his first term, and Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, ascended to the White House. Coolidge then won his own four-year presidential term as the Republican nominee in 1924. In 1927, Calvin Coolidge decides that he is not going to seek re-election, which essentially makes the presidential election of 1928 an open race, an open seat with no incumbent seeking re-election. Now, I should mention here that Coolidge announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election, but some historians speculate that he was hoping to be asked or drafted, if you will, into the presidency. This time period in the 1920s, there was still quite a bit of 19th century sensibilities when it came to presidential politics, and particularly when it came to presidential campaigning, as candidates often believed that the office sought the man and not the other way around. And we saw that with the front porch campaigns of James Garfield in 1880 and Benjamin Harrison in 1888, and again with William McKinley in 1896. If you remember our discussion on that election earlier this semester, McKinley was opposed by William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate who went on a railway tour of the country, speaking as often as he could to as many people as he could extemporaneously. McKinley chose the opposite tact strategically, which was to deliver prepared addresses from the front porch of his home and receive invited guests who came to listen to those speeches. McKinley won that race in 1896, and Warren Harding, in sort of a throwback to the 19th century, went back to the front porch campaign tactic and won in 1920. So depending on the president and depending on the election cycle, or I should say depending on the presidential candidate, and depending on the election cycle, you had folks that were comfortable seeking the office themselves and going out to stump for the presidency. William Jennings Bryan sort of started that strategy in 1896, and other candidates employed it from time to time in the 2 decades since then. But there are some historians that speculate that Coolidge initially declined to run for re-election in 1928, a year or so before, or 6 months or so before the calendar turned to 1928, with the hope that Republican Party leaders would encourage him and implore him to run for re-election, or that perhaps it might be an issue that would be taken up at the presidential, at the Republican National, the Republican National Convention in 1928. But Coolidge, if that was his strategy, it did not work. No one wanted to draft him or ask for 4 more years of the Coolidge administration, even though on the surface America was prosperous economically and the country was not in any significant military engagement or war of any kind. But with Coolidge out of the way, Herbert Hoover, who had first emerged in the second term of Woodrow Wilson's presidency as the food administrator for the U.S. during World War I, when Harding was elected Hoover president in 1920, he chose Hoover to serve as his Commerce Secretary, Secretary of Commerce, a cabinet-level position. Hoover continued in that Commerce Secretary role throughout the Calvin Coolidge administration and had quite a bit of power when it came to setting the agenda for financial policy for the president, both for under Harding and under Coolidge. Hoover was very influential in that role as Commerce Secretary. But in 1928, he sought the Republican nomination and wound up receiving the nomination and was the Republican presidential candidate. His opponent in the general election was Al Smith, the Democratic nominee. Smith was the governor of New York at the time. And this campaign presented the American public and the American electorate with a contrast in personalities as well as policy agenda. Hoover wanted to continue the pro-business policies that Harding and Coolidge had ushered in during their presidencies, their administrations. And he also wanted to continue prohibition, which had started in 1920. That was federal law that outlawed the sale, distribution, and possession and consumption of alcoholic beverages. It had been on the books since the start of the Harding administration in early 1921. Hoover made it very clear that he wanted to continue the policy of prohibition as federal law. And Hoover, in general, possessed a conservative personality, and he had roots in rural America, small town Iowa, to be precise. So he appealed to a lot of white Protestants, particularly those from rural America and those who embodied or believed in, I should say, fundamentalism. People that believed in the fundamentalist Christian, the vision of fundamentalist Christianity that we spoke about last week with regard to the Scopes trial and some of the other cultural clashes that were on display in the mid-1920s. Hoover was the candidate that appealed to Americans who identified with small-town America, rural America, who identified with and supported a pro-business conservative, and also someone who wanted to continue prohibition and really, generally speaking, promote an American cultural life that was conservative and old-fashioned, for lack of a better term. On the opposite side, you had Al Smith, the New York governor, who was a Democrat. Smith himself was the son of Irish immigrants. So he was not someone that could trace his ancestry to America in the 18th century or early 19th century. He was sort of part of this new wave of foreign-born immigrant Americans and the sons and daughters of these immigrant Americans, as he was the son of Irish immigrants. He was a devout Catholic, and he publicly opposed prohibition. He thought America would be better off repealing prohibition and returning to the pre-1921 atmosphere when Americans of legal drinking age could purchase alcohol and drink in their homes or at social events or go to their local tavern. At this time, while prohibition was still on the books, Americans, if they were going to drink, they were obviously committing an illegal act, and they're going to places that were off the beaten path and generally speaking hidden from public view, speakeasies. And people knew where speakeasies were. They were popular places to drink and socialize, but you just couldn't do it out in the open the way that you could do in bars and taverns before the early 1920s, and the way that we can do in modern America today. So Smith wanted to repeal the 18th Amendment, which was the amendment that made prohibition federal law. So this anti-prohibition position of Al Smith's prompted attacks from Protestant fundamentalists on one side, and his Catholic faith made him vulnerable to a smear campaign by the Ku Klux Klan on the other side. We talked about the Klan's rise in the mid-1920s, and even though by the later years of the 1920s the organization was hemorrhaging members, they still had tens of thousands of members. So if they got full or close to full participation, a smear campaign could be effective. The arguments that they used against Smith was very similar to arguments that would be used in the 1960 presidential campaign when John F. Kennedy was the Democratic nominee. John F. Kennedy, like Al Smith before him, was a Catholic, and his Catholic faith was a target of attack during the campaign, and in particular, the groups that opposed the idea of a Catholic president basically argued that the president would be, Smith if he would won in 1928, and Kennedy if he won in 1960, that the president would be beholden to the Pope, that the Pope and the Vatican would sort of have the leader in the White House that they could control like a puppeteer controlling a puppet. And that was what the Ku Klux Klan and what others who were skeptical of Catholic leadership felt with Al Smith and with John F. Kennedy. They smeared Al Smith. It worked, as Smith lost the election to Hoover. It did not work in the case of John F. Kennedy, as Kennedy won election in 1960. And more recently, in the latest presidential election, Joe Biden was elected president, and Joe Biden, like Kennedy and Smith, is a practicing Catholic. Back to the election of 1928, I mentioned that Herbert Hoover won the election, and he won it in a landslide. He won the popular vote by 6 million votes, 21 million to 15 million. He really overwhelmed Smith in the Electoral College with 444 electoral votes for Herbert Hoover and 87 votes for Al Smith in the Electoral College. If you take a look at the photograph in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, that is a picture of Herbert Hoover sitting at his desk after taking the office of president in 1929. So Hoover wins the election and becomes the president of the United States. And even though he wants to continue the pro-business policies that Harding had ushered in and that Coolidge had maintained and continued, Hoover does have a series of progressive policies or initiatives that he introduces early in his presidency, including tax reductions for low-income workers. Harding and Coolidge had endorsed the tax reduction policies or the tax reduction recommendation from their Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, but those were primarily tax reductions for the wealthy Americans and corporations, not necessarily tax cuts for the ordinary rank-and-file factory worker or low-income worker. But that was the type of tax cuts that Herbert Hoover supported when he became president. He also refused to obstruct protesters from picketing the White House, and he also suggested that America end its policy, the federal government, I should say, end its policy of corruption and graft in the patronage process. And what does that mean exactly? That means presidents appointing individuals to key posts in the bureaucracy, traditionally for generations that had been done in sort of a quid pro quo type matter where people that were friends and supporters of the president, especially if they helped the president campaign or gave campaign contributions, that they would be rewarded with a federal job at the head of some bureaucratic agency, or perhaps as the assistant director of some organization of that kind. Hoover proposed an end to that process, or at least to scale it back and drastically reduce the number of appointees to those civil service positions and provide more opportunity for career civil servants and less for campaign supporters of the president. In addition, Hoover was fairly progressive in his support of African American, I don't want to say African American causes here, but Hoover supported his wife's decision to invite African American dignitaries to the White House. This was still a very controversial type of practice that during the era of Jim Crow, which this was in the late 1920s. Also, Hoover tried to secure some federal funding for Howard University, prominent HBCU, in Washington, D.C. Hoover also persuaded Congress to pass the Agricultural Marketing Act in 1929, which drastically increased aid for farmers. It created the Federal Farm Board that had $500 million in funds that could be issued to assist farm cooperatives in marketing commodities and purchasing the act of purchasing surplus crops when necessary. Hoover also proposed a tariff increase on imported farm products with the idea of protecting farmers even further. However, in the interest of party unity and solidarity, he signed the Hawley-Smoot tariff in 1930, a piece of legislation initiated by a Republican congressman that would not just increase tariffs on farm products, but it also would increase tariffs on manufactured goods. This was a controversial piece of legislation Many economists of the era urged Hoover to veto this tariff because they warned of the potential consequences, but Hoover remained loyal to Republican congressional leaders and thought that by signing this legislation, it would boost the party in the 1930 midterm elections, as he signed this in 1930. Unfortunately for the American public, the economists' fears proved correct. The tariff led to higher costs for U.S. exports. Foreign nations, as you might imagine, were not happy about higher tariffs on products that they tried to import into the U.S., both farm and manufactured products. So they enacted reprisals against the U.S., and the end result was that prices on consumer products in America soared, which, of course, affected the rank and file American on a daily basis, having to pay more money for consumer products as a effect of the Hawley-Smoot tariff, the controversial law that Hoover signed, a controversial bill, I should say, that Hoover signed, making it into a law. So, with that in mind, we'll take a look at the rest of Hoover's first year as president, and really looking at now the coming of the Great Depression, the dawn of the Great Depression, which occurred during year one of Herbert Hoover's presidency. So you sort of have to take a look at an event like the Great Depression and examine it from a variety of aspects. Particularly, you want to look at it through the causes of the Great Depression, because it wasn't like people woke up one day in late October of 1929 and the stock market crashed, and there hadn't been underlining warning signs that something like this was possible. But it was a situation where many Americans were shocked by the suddenness of it all. They didn't see the warning signs coming, or they ignored the warning signs. So let's begin by looking at the atmosphere economically in the 1920s. We've mentioned multiple times in recent lectures the pro-business policies of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. These policies allowed American businesses and corporations to have a great deal of control in their day-to-day operations without having to worry about federal oversight or federal regulation. There were tax cuts for wealthy Americans and for corporations during this time, and it led to a general economic prosperity. Part of that also was the fact that World War I was over, and the American economy began to grow with an increase in sales of automobiles that were being mass-produced for the first time and really affordable for the everyday American for the first time. Of course, not all Americans could afford automobiles in the early to mid-1920s, but they were far more affordable for much of the population than they had been prior to 1920. The 1920s were also the first decade in which ordinary Americans began to invest either in the stock market or in securities as in some way, shape, or form, bonds or things of that nature. Actually, when America went to World War I, the government created Liberty bonds that they marketed to the public to get American support for the war, and also American support in terms of from a morale standpoint, but even more so from an economic standpoint, because by promoting the sale of Liberty bonds and by convincing Americans to buy Liberty bonds, the funds raised through selling Liberty bonds during World War I would help pay down the war debt for the federal government. So the tactics that had been used by the federal government to sell Liberty bonds during World War I, those same tactics were used by companies to sell stocks and other securities in the 1920s to rank-and-file Americans. The stock market existed before the 1920s. It had been around since the 19th century, but if you look at the very final days of the 19th century in late 1899 and the early days of that first decade of the 20th century, the early 1900s, the stock market was pretty much exclusively the domain of wealthy Americans, wealthy elites, corporations, financial trusts, things of that nature. You just didn't see regular, middle class or even working class or lower income Americans investing any money in the stock market in, say, 1899 or 1900 or 1904. It was infinitesimal how their participation in the stock market at that time. But as I mentioned, a lot of Americans purchased Liberty bonds to help the war effort during World War I. In fact, well over 50% of the country, of the country's households, bought some kind of Liberty bond or stock through the war effort in the late 1917 and 1918 when America entered the war. So companies, as I mentioned, began to promote stock sales to Americans using that same sort of patriotic symbolism and patriotic messaging to get them to invest into the market. There was still plenty of participation in the stock market and the securities markets were from the wealthy elites and the corporations. And some brokerage houses didn't even bother to try to solicit business from rank and file Americans because they just thought that there wasn't enough profit there. There wasn't enough money that they could make by trying to attract the average American family or the average American couple to invest in the stock market. However, there were some companies such as AT&T and Bell that actively sought investment from regular Americans. They promoted this and really wanted to increase the value of their companies through the sale of stock to average Americans. In addition, some companies initiated employee stock option programs during this time period, which many labor unions objected to, but those programs sort of begin in the 1920s. They're still around today, depending on the individual companies, but employee stock option programs still exist in the world of American investment and securities markets today. So the late 1920s, toward the end of Calvin Coolidge's presidency, that's when things really begin to shift economically in America as tax reductions resulted in an influx of money into the stock market, and individuals at that time could purchase stock on margin. And what that entailed basically was that an individual investor that wanted to buy a stock and perhaps couldn't pay for the full price of the stock up front would put a down payment that was usually in the neighborhood of 10% to acquire the stock. The broker held on to the stock in case of a downturn on the market. And if the stock's value declined sharply, the brokers could then sell the stock if the buyers failed to pay off the remaining 80 or 90% that they owed, so that they could recoup their money in some way. This system sounded good in theory, but it backfired when sales of automobiles and residential homes began to plateau in 1927. So that's a good segue into another cause of the stock market crash in the Great Depression. By the late 1920s, there was market saturation. The production of and sales of consumer products in the early to mid 1920s soared due to a lot of the initiatives and policies of Harding and Coolidge and Hoover as Commerce Secretary during this time that we've discussed, the pro-business initiatives. It resulted in the production and sales of automobiles, radios, and residential homes. And we've talked about how automobiles were prevalent more so by the mid-1920s than they had ever been in America, because they were more affordable than they'd ever been, and more Americans wanted to purchase cars. However, by the late 1920s, the inventory of these products outnumbered the public's demand for them, because most Americans who could afford to purchase a car had bought one sometime in the early to mid 1920s, and they didn't need to purchase a new car by 1927 or 1928. The old one worked just fine. So there was no need for a second car for most families at that time, and many of them were able to continue to operate the original car that they had purchased a few years earlier. So sales of automobiles began to decline by 1927. Also, items like the radio, which was the chief form of entertainment in America in the 1920s, as people purchased radios in large numbers in the early to middle years of the decade. They would have a radio in their house so they could listen to the news, so they could listen to play-by-play of their favorite sporting events, especially Major League Baseball games, college football games, and heavyweight boxing fights, and the variety of serial entertainment programs that were aired over the radio. But usually, an American family would only need one radio in the house. They didn't need multiple radios. So you would buy one radio in, say, 1922, 1923, 1924, and by 1927, 1928, that first radio that you purchased several years earlier was still quite functional and effective. You didn't need to buy another radio. So again, sales begin to decline for radios during this time, as well as automobiles. The market for residential homes began to decline as well. All of this results in a limit in production by companies that made cars and made radios, and as they weren't selling as many of their products, they didn't need to necessarily make as many products going forward, because the last thing you wanted to do was make more inventory that would just sit unsold for months and months on end. That led to the laying off of workers, and people began to lose their jobs by 1927, 1928 in larger numbers, but still not large enough that it caused national panic at that point. But this industrial decline coincided with a downturn in America's agricultural markets at the same time, as farmers began to have difficulty selling their products or selling all of the products that they had received or that they were able to harvest across the country. And they became overextended financially as well. So a combination of factors, the decline in revenue in production in America's manufacturing sector, a downturn in America's agricultural market, and the speculative gambling with regard to stocks and securities reached a tipping point in October of 1929, and stock prices and stock values began to tumble. The stock market crashed on Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday. In one day, the market index plummeted by 13%, the largest single-day decline in U.S. history. But if you take a longer look and just look at the entire month of October 1929, you'll see that the overall value of stocks on the New York Stock Exchange dropped by an average of 37%. The average price of an individual stock fell by 37% from October 1st, 1929 to the end of October 1929. And as a result, less than a year into his presidency, Herbert Hoover encountered the largest financial crisis in the nation's history, and this decade of prosperity that had entranced Americans since really the end of World War I was now coming to an abrupt and crashing halt. And if you take a look at the picture on in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you can see this is in the wake of Black Tuesday, sometime in the late fall of 1929. You see some gentlemen surrounding an automobile there, and the sign covering the windshield of the car says, $100 will buy this car, must have cash, lost all on the stock market. And that pretty much sums it up right there. They needed money to go forward. They were willing to take $100 for their car because they had lost all of their assets in the stock market. They no longer could afford the car, but they were only willing to part with the car for $100 in cash in late 1929. So that will wrap up today's lecture. I will talk to you again on Tuesday, and we will take a look at Hoover's response to the stock market crash and the dawn of the Great Depression, as well as we will take a look at the 1932 presidential election as Hoover seeks to win a second term amidst this historic economic and financial crisis in America.